Thanks so much, Wade. Can you hear me in the back? Thanks so much, Wade. Very generous words. I hope you'll all take advantage of some of the events that Wade alluded to over the next few days. Okay, Wallace, how does that sound? Okay. I hope you'll all take advantage of the events that Wade alluded to that will take place over the next week, and especially the one where Wade has a speaking part, which will be at Capitol Square on Saturday. And before I begin, I especially want to thank Ed Ayers. Since he became president of the University of Richmond, Dr. Freud, what would you say about that? Since he became the president of UR, I can think of no one who's done more to help us look more dispassionately at our city's past than Ed Ayers. And there he is in the back. I was told he would arrive late from a speaking engagement of his own with tires squealing. Well, we're here to mark the fall of Confederate Richmond after 4 years of bloody fighting, and to remember the great evacuation and fire that engulfed the city beginning 150 years ago today. That fire symbolized the end of one era and the beginning of another. You know, it doesn't seem like 150 years ago to me. Well, it doesn't to me. And if there was ever a time to trot out William Faulkner's quote about history, this has to be it. You know what Faulkner said, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." Now, historians, like everyone else, sometimes lack a sense of humility. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. And I think that comes from the fact that we know how events of the past turned out. The people who lived through them did not, and that detachment sometimes, I think, makes us a little unwilling, not have the humility to put ourselves in the shoes of the people who lived through those events, not knowing what would happen the next day or the next month. What we really need to do is to have the humility to walk in their footsteps, to look through the eyes of eyewitnesses. And I'll give you an example. When Richmond Burning first came out, I was interviewed by a local television news reporter, and the first question was, "Well, Dr. Lankford, how many eyewitnesses of the fire did you interview?" I restrained myself from being cruel. But the reporter was on to something, because I think ordinary people understand that it's the eyewitnesses who give us the best lens for looking at history. So today I want to help you look through these events through the eyes of eyewitnesses, and I'll give some quotations from sources, most of which were written, if not the next day, the next week. They saw wonderful and terrible sights that April. Think about it. In the course of 3 days, the Confederate Army retreats, the Southern government evacuates its capital, the city burns, the Union Army marches in, slavery ends, and Abraham Lincoln himself walks through the smoking ruins. It doesn't get any more dramatic than that in Virginia history, or indeed in American history. So today I'd like to go through that story in 3 acts. Act 1, April the 2nd, the eve of destruction and the evacuation. April 3rd, chaos, fire, occupation. Act 3, April 4th, the improbable visit of Abraham Lincoln and its aftermath. So Act 1, the eve of destruction and evacuation. It was another April of 1861, when Virginia threw in its lot with the Confederacy, a new republic formed by 7 slave states in the Deep South. After the Confederacy moved its capital here, the city of Richmond swelled to maybe 3 times its pre-war size of 40,000. Soldiers, bureaucrats, opportunists, and refugees all crowded into the city. After 4 years of fighting and watching fighting from afar, Richmond now saw the war at its doorsteps, and the people were exhausted. For the past year, the armies of Grant and Lee down near Petersburg came to a kind of a standoff, and constructed huge earthworks and lines of fortifications in an arc 40 miles from northeast of Richmond down to Petersburg and beyond. The physical stamp of war was everywhere. The Confederate commander in Richmond was Richard Stoddard Ewell, an irascible general with a wooden leg after Second Manassas. He commanded maybe 5,000 regular troops and a few thousand more irregular reserves of questionable value. And as time went on, his little army, like Lee's larger one at Petersburg, suffered a silent attrition because desertion was the metronome of defeat that quickened its pace as the year moved on through March. However, despite these earthworks, it's not technically correct to say that Richmond was under siege because the earthworks did not go all around the city. There were still roads and railroads to the southwest where you could go to Confederate-held territory. So even though it was not technically a siege, it felt like it to Richmonders. Nobody was starving, but there was widespread privation and malnourishment. Sad notices appeared in the newspapers of people selling treasured family heirlooms for money to buy food. There are sadder notices frequently of funerals. And perhaps even sadder were the completely unheralded burials at Hollywood Cemetery of soldiers who died in the great military hospital east of town, Chimborazo. The growing possibility that the Confederacy might evacuate the city led to plans for evacuation and for demolition. Now, after the Great Fire, there would be much finger pointing, but a great internal debate began even before the fire. General Ewell and the Richmond Provost Marshal, Isaac Carrington, planned to burn the railroad bridges and warehouses of government-owned tobacco. The chief ordnance officer objected to burning the tobacco. He said you could ruin it just as easily by pouring turpentine on it. The chief engineer objected to burning the railroad bridges. But Ewell's plan for burning carried the day. He and his men were about to learn the old adage, man plans, God laughs. While the military began its plans to evacuate, Confederate bureaucrats made some plans to move their paperwork empire to Danville. But they didn't do it vigorously enough to alarm civilians, nor did they do it vigorously enough to get the job done in time. It had been raining a lot in late March. And soon, when the sun came out and dried up the dirt roads of Virginia, Grant would make his move. It came on April the 1st in the aftermath of the Battle of Five Forks. The Union Army cut the Confederate lines there. Lee would have to retreat, and not on his own terms. Richmond would fall. Here's what one Confederate soldier wrote in his diary on that very day, April the 1st. He said, "We are in a tight box now, and only wondering where and when our lines will be broken." Sunday morning, April 2nd, dawned sunny, bright, and warm, an omen of the spring to come. One resident remembered seeing the fields across the river glistening in the sun as church bells called the devout to services. Here at St. Paul's, Charles Minigarota had been the rector since 1856. He looked out at his congregation over professorial wire-rimmed glasses as the light streamed through the east windows as it is today. Now, Vinegar Road is a great example of how America allows immigrants to reinvent themselves. Because in the Germany of his youth, he was a radical revolutionary, a communist before Marx. He was jailed for his opinion. When he was freed, he came to this country, then taught at William and Mary, became an Episcopal priest, and by the time of the war, became a devout Confederate. We have conflicting accounts about which scripture lessons were read that day, but my favorite is this one. It's from Psalm 46. He maketh wars to cease unto the end of the earth. He breaketh the bow and cutteth the spear in sunder. He burneth the chariot of fire. The most famous parishioner at St. Paul's was sitting in his accustomed pew. And I'm happy to say that a relation of the president, Bertram Hayes Davis, is with us today in Jefferson Davis's accustomed pew. And Bertram, I hope you won't get up and leave when I get to that point in the story. Thank you for being here. It's hard to believe it, but Davis was not yet 60 years old. He looked old, though. Old, tired, and gray. Troubled by a nervous stomach and blindness in one eye, weighted down by the burdens of office. He'd become increasingly autocratic and ill at ease in his relations with others, but he was devoted to his cause. If there's a disagreement about the scripture lessons that were read, there's even less agreement about what happened, how Davis received the bad news from the South. Here's what I think I pieced together what happened. Just before communion began, a messenger at the back of the church brought a piece of paper down to the president's pew, tapped him on the shoulder, gave him the paper. Davis read it and left. It wasn't the first time that duty had caused Davis to leave church early. And some people professed to see a look of alarm in his good eye as he strode out. But another eyewitness said his face was impassive and she could read nothing in it. I think that's probably a fair assumption. What the sexton brought Davis was a copy of a War Department telegram that the War Department had just received from Lee. His lines were broken. He must retreat to save his army. Davis had to evacuate the government and the city that night. In fact, though, it wasn't the first time that Davis had received the bad news from Lee. Earlier the same day, he'd received a note to the same effect from Lee on his way to St. Paul's. But he decided to keep on his way to church and hoping that things would clarify and maybe the next message would not be so dire. It was not to be. False alarms had scared parishioners at St. Paul's before, so the service continued. It was only when the sexton brought notes to other government officials and repeatedly asked them to leave that ripples of concern washed over the congregation. A Navy clerk who was here that day wrote with apocalyptic words about the scene as the service ended. Had an unseen hand written the coming doom on the wall in letters of fire, the effect could not have been more appalling or instantaneous. The same scenes repeated themselves at the end of church services across Richmond. Government officials hurried to pack up for the trip to Danville. General Ewell's orders for Confederate forces east of town to evacuate that night. If he was really lucky, he might extricate his little army without alerting the Union forces opposite him. If all went according to plan, by dawn, the last soldiers would be across Mayo's toll bridge, the only one in Richmond for vehicles and pedestrians. When the rear guard passed over the bridge, engineers would burn it. By then, they already would have fired the warehouses and the railroad bridges. You can visualize the evacuation as kind of a funnel. From all corners of Richmond, streams of Confederate soldiers, civilians, and bureaucrats streaming down towards the choke point. The choke point was defined by 3 nearby bridges, 2 railroad bridges and Mayo's toll bridge, all right there together at the north side of the river. For the rest of the afternoon, the government district was a scene of panic. Treasury clerks did a kind of a triage on their papers, some to save, some to burn, some to abandon. One of them wrote afterwards, they kept the furnace in the basement going red hot with Confederate notes, spawns, and papers. While the government scurried to evacuate to Danville and the Army prepared to leave its trenches east of town, the city fathers talked about how to surrender. Mayor Joseph Mayo convened the city council at 4 p.m. The first decision it made was to destroy the liquor supply. This sounds odd, but they knew that as soon as the Army left, civil order would break down. And if the looters, who are sure to show up, had got their hands on the government's liquor supply, it would make matters far worse. After they made a plan to do that, they appointed a delegation to go out east of town to meet federal officials and surrender the city. What about the 40% of Richmonders who are African American? At the African Baptist Church on Broad Street, the white minister, Dr. Ryland, preached his last sermon to a congregation half free and half slave. After church, a white observer said this: "The Negroes stand about mostly silent, as if wondering what will be their fate. They make no demonstrations of joy." He expected them to show more joy about their coming liberation. But he misinterpreted their silence because they were just prudently keeping their counsel under the last hours of Confederate rule. They'd make their true sentiments known soon enough. In the evening, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet made their way to the depot of the Richmond and Danville Railroad. It was on the north side of the river at the foot of 14th Street next to Mayo's Toll Bridge. There are two special government trains. Midshipmen from the Naval Academy had arrived earlier to provide security. They fixed bayonets and cleared the depot, waiting for Davis and his cabinet. It was nearly midnight when the presidential train inched out onto the trestle over the James. On the left side, the passengers could see the sad sight of Army engineers piling up barrels of tar and turpentine for the last act of demolition. The second special train, with midshipmen stationed in each car, each armed with 2 revolvers each, was the Treasury Train. This was the famous Treasury Train about which so much has been written, and no doubt more will be written. We really don't know very much about what was on it. Perhaps the value was $250,000, perhaps $500,000. Mexican silver dollars, double-eel gold coins, some small ingots in square boxes, but less than half of it belonged to the Confederate government. The rest was the private property of banks. The highest Confederate official left in Richmond was Assistant Secretary of War John Archibald Campbell. He was a former Supreme Court justice. He was a cold, hard, and intelligent man with a high forehead and bushy eyebrows. He didn't think much of Jefferson Davis and didn't have an official duty from the Southern government, but he stayed behind because he wanted to do one more thing for the Confederacy, and if he had succeeded, he might have altered the way the war ended dramatically. We'll come back to Campbell in a minute. So Act 2, chaos, burning, occupation. As April 2nd turned into April 3rd, the last trains departed. Civil order broke down. The ominous sound of axes chopping and glass shattering conjured up a crowd. Soon there were looters breaking in everywhere, especially into the barrels of liquor that the city council hadn't been able to destroy. But even so, men, women, and children got down on their hands and knees and scooped up the liquid from the gutters. And there were many, many contemporary sources that cite this event, and I believe it's true. It sounds exaggerated, but they were drinking whiskey from the gutters. At the commissary depot, General Ewell's soldiers packed up as much as they could to rendezvous with Lee's army. When they'd filled as many wagons as they had horses to pull, they threw open the doors. A crowd had gathered there and rushed in. They scrapped and brawled for whatever the quartermasters had left behind. Sacks of flour, bags of sugar, even coffee beans smuggled through the blockade. For people who were malnourished, it was like finding Aladdin's cave. A bit before dawn, Ewell told Provost Marshal Carrington his men must do their duty and light the fires as planned. Up to this point, it had been a completely calm evening, so when they lit the fires, the smoke went straight up in the air. But very soon after, a stiff breeze arose from the south, and it was an ill wind for Richmond as the sun rose red and angry. The arsenal caught fire too. The exploding artillery shells made it look and sound like a summer thunderstorm. The Navy's ships began to explode when they were demolished in the river, added to the chorus. There was a pro-Southern reporter from the London Times, Frank Lawley, who was here and witnessed that. And his last dispatch from Richmond before he fled north, he quoted Shakespeare's Tempest in talking about anarchy in the streets of Richmond. Hell is empty and all the devils are here. By now, Mayo's Bridge was the only way across the river that was not on fire. Clement Sullivan was the officer tasked with firing the bridge after the last Southern soldier had crossed. It was a heavy burden for this 26-year-old Maryland captain. I mean, how was he going to tell when the last Confederate soldiers crossed? There were looters at the north end of the bridge. There were civilians streaming across, as well as military units. There were individual soldiers. A very difficult thing. The rear guard finally showed up under South Carolinian Martin Gary, and they had to actually use the flat of their sabers to scatter the looters from the end of the bridge. When Gary reached the bridge, he turned to Sullivan and said, all over, goodbye, blow her to hell, and trotted over the bridge. With that assurance, Sullivan and two other officers walked across the bridge, lighting the combustible material as they went, leaving the north end of the bridge wrapped in smoke and flame. Halfway across, they saw the first Union horsemen galloping down Main Street. When they reached 14th Street, they wheeled and turned for the bridge. They were thwarted, though, by the fire on either side and by the fire at the north end of the bridge. They were more interested in reaching Capitol Square anyway, so they fired a few shots and turned away. Despite Martin Gary's assurance to Sullivan that his men were the last Confederates, others made their way to the burning bridge. Several claimed to have been the very last. One of them, W.L. Timberlake, said, "If any crossed after we did, they need have no fear of the other world, because surely they were fireproof." It was about 8 o'clock now, and the sun was well up in the sky. It had burned through the early morning mist. A small group of Confederate officers stood on the south bank of the river, in relative safety for the time being, because the Union couldn't get across now that the bridges were all burning. And they watched this terrible sight of the city burning. One of them was a young artillery officer, Porter Alexander. He left an elegant quote describing the scene that he viewed. And I'm not going to quote him to you because you'll have to go to Waite Rawls's talk on Saturday to hear that wonderful quotation by Porter Alexander. But it was all about his impression about seeing the city they had fought for so long being consumed by fire. The Union force east of town was led by a very young Major General, Godfrey Weitzel. He was an earnest West Point engineer who sported a great black beard that made him look a lot older than his 29 years. Weitzel was a cautious man, not a bold field commander. He worried about sending his men through Confederate minefields to get into Richmond. When the order to advance came, they did have to go through minefields, but they did not have to face Southern cannon fire because Ewell had been able to extricate his army without alerting the Union forces. You see, there would be no battle for Richmond. No battle of Richmond. The battle for Richmond had already been fought to the south between the far greater army of Grant and Lee. So there was no fighting in Richmond. Those few shots fired by the Union cavalrymen to the Confederate soldiers burning Mayo's Bridge, that was about the only gunfire that I can record, gunfire in anger. Mayor Mayo rode in a carriage east of town past the last retreating Confederates. One of his councilmen, James Scott, was with him, and we have a Scott descendant here today. The rear guard recognized the mayor's mission because the driver waved a piece of white flag. Mayo ran into a mounted escort from Weitzel's headquarters, led by Major Atherton Stevens of the 4th Massachusetts Cavalry. He read Mayo's document, promised him that the Union Army was there to protect people and property, told the mayor to follow him into Richmond, and they repeated a brief surrender ceremony at City Hall. By then, the fires were out of control and sweeping through the business district. Even before they occupied Richmond, Union soldiers argued about which unit got here first. A group of white soldiers under General Charles Stevens claimed the honor, but a group of United States colored troops under August Couch said they were the first ones to cross the border between Henrico County and Richmond. Now, this dispute had no military value, but it shows racial tensions within the Union Army, and it was an ill omen for things to come. Similarly, Union soldiers argued about who planted the first flag over the Capitol. But in fact, the first man to do that, to plant Old Glory on the Virginia State Capitol, was a 17-year-old civilian who got there before anyone in uniform. He was Richard Forrester, 17-year-old mixed-race grandson of Gustavus Myers, a prominent member of the legislature and of the Virginia Historical Society. Forrester had saved the flag that the legislature had used before the war, kept it hidden, and then on this day he took it up to the Capitol and put it on the roof. Some Union soldiers marching into town were astonished at their reception. Sergeant Edwin Ware of the 13th New Hampshire Regiment wrote this: "The Negroes and many of the lower class of whites were perfectly extravagant in their expressions of delight." Now, I think Captain Linus Sherman with the 9th Vermont Regiment was perhaps closer to the mark because of what he wrote in a letter home the very next day, the day after the fire. He said, "People generally are glad to see us here, not, I suppose, from much of a real Union sentiment, but because they have suffered so much." Die-hard Confederates weren't ready to give up just yet. Judith McGuire snarled to her diary, "Union men began to show themselves. Treason walked abroad." If the reaction of white Richmonders was somewhat mixed, this was not the case with African Americans. Crowds of black people gathered around the Union regiments as they marched into town and cheered them. According to tradition, people freed from Lumpkin slave jail that day were the first to sing words of the song, "Slavery Chain Done Broke at Last." No black Union soldier was prouder than Garland White. He was a chaplain of the 28th United States Colored Troops. 35 years before, he'd been born into slavery in Richmond. He'd escaped to the North as a youth, became a minister, and then when the war came, joined as a chaplain for one of the black regiments, the USCT. When his regiment will march through town, the freed people gathered around them and followed them to the western edge of town where the regiment stacked its arms. And White's colleagues asked him to say a few words, and that was appropriate because he was a gifted exhorter. He was a preacher and a native son come home in glory. He began to address the crowd, in his words, about freedom for all mankind, but he got so choked up he had to stop. At that point, some of his fellow soldiers brought him an old woman who wanted to quiz him, and after she'd asked him a few questions, she said, This is your mother, Garland, who spent 20 years of grief about her son. A true story. By the time Garland White met his mother, the Union Army had flooded into the city. At the governor's mansion, General Weitzel dictated a telegram. It read, "We took possession of Richmond at 8:15 a.m. I captured many guns. But the rebels eventually left in great haste. I am using every effort to put out the fire." He gave the paper to an orderly and told the man to ride east, hell for leather, because only 3 miles to the east was his telegraph station of the night before. And from that point, this message flashed at the speed of light to the whole North. Weitzel took up a position on the steps of the Capitol, on the east side of the Capitol, in order to assess the situation. One of his staff said they looked down on a gigantic crater of fire. An eyewitness writing with purple prose described the sun shining through the smoke like a great beacon of woe, or the awful, unlashed eye of an avenging deity. Not everybody was sorry. Over on Churchill, Elizabeth Van Loo sat out in front of her mansion and watched. This is what she wrote. She said, the famous Union spy wrote this, that the fires fill the sky with clouds of smoke as incense from the land for its deliverance. What a moment, avenging wrath appeased in flames. At the foot of the square, only the stone customs house remained. Flames reduced every building around it to ash. None of the banks escaped. J.B. Jones, a dyspeptic Confederate clerk, counted them up 2 days later. The burnt district, he exclaimed, includes all the banks, money changers, and principal speculators and extortionists. This seems like a decree from above. Most of the newspapers burned, and the fire put out a number of printers too. Although one of them, just by chance, had moved his press and his paper stock to safety a week earlier. His name was Edward Ayres. By the time the fire subsided late that afternoon, hundreds of buildings had disappeared, maybe 800, maybe 1,000. The view from Main Street down to the river between 8th and 15th Street embraced the shocking sight, smoking ruins and mounds of rubble everywhere. But despite the image of photographs, only about 10% of the area of the city burned. Outside the central district, most of the housing survived. But even though a small portion of the city burned, it constituted 9/10 of the business district. So all the jobs went up in smoke. The Union Army tried to fight the flames, but it was mostly a matter of letting the fire burn itself out as the wind subsided late in the afternoon. Susan Hoag was the wife of Presbyterian minister Moses Drury Hoag, and I think we might have one of her descendants here. She was no Union sympathizer, but she wrote her husband, who had fled to Danville, "The Yankees put a stop to looting and made the Negroes work to put out the fire, and they worked hard themselves," which is quite an admission for a very strong Confederate. Surprisingly few people died in the fire. If you add up all the accounts, including clearly exaggerated ones, you still can't get above 24. One thing that both Union and Confederate observers could agree on that first night under occupation was the extraordinary quiet. No steam whistles, no squealing train brakes, no familiar bells tolling the hours. An embittered Confederate journalist recalled that a strange quiet fell on the blackened city, the quiet of a great desolation. So now we come to Act 3, Lincoln's visit, April the 4th, and aftermath. When the sun came out the next day, April the 4th, one newspaper had escaped burning and was back in business, publishing a single sheet, and they could do that because they agreed to publish only pro-Union sentiment. They even published a satirical obituary printed in black bordered type. It read, "Died at the late residence of his father, J. Davis, Richmond, Virginia, Southern Confederacy, age 4 years, death caused by strangulation. The supporters of the Confederacy could hold conflicting opinions. We do that all the time, and they did then. They could honestly be grateful to the Union soldiers for helping fight the fire. They blamed Jefferson Davis for causing it, and they still prayed that Lee would return with a flaming sword and drive the enemy from their city. I find the week between, most of a week between occupation and news of Appomattox the most interesting, because nobody knows what's going on with the armies of Grant and Lee. They faded away to the southwest. Appomattox is still just a name on a map. Richmond dominated the news in the north that week. War reporters marched into town and dictated long articles sent over the military telegraph to newspapers across the north. And photographers came a couple of days later and exposed hundreds of glass plate negatives showing the ruins. The enterprising staff of the Richmond Whig even published a map, and they colored in all the burnt blocks and sold it as a souvenir to Union soldiers. I'm sure you all know the image of the Currier and Ives image of showing Confederates fleeing across Mayo's Bridge with the city burning behind. That image and those photographs have left an indelible impression on Americans for generations to come. That week, there was a great Jubilee meeting at the African Baptist Church on Broad Street. The church could hold maybe 1,000 people, but there were more than 2,000 there that day. Freed people and members of the United States colored troops. No black man had been permitted to preach from the high pulpit before, and Chaplain David Stevens of the 35th United States Colored Troops was the first African-American clergyman to have that honor. Thomas Chester, a black reporter from Philadelphia, who had marched into town with the Army on Monday, recorded the scene of immense joy. Godfrey Weitzel had no time for celebration. He was busy with the burden of occupation. He had to make the city militarily secure. Union officers were afraid of Confederate counterattack. He also had to bring in food and water for the city's residents and his soldiers, and he tried to get utilities and transportation back online. And though he didn't know it, he was about to fall into hot water with his superiors. In Washington, Edwin Stanton didn't trust Weitzel. Stanton, you remember, was Lincoln's forceful Secretary of War. He didn't trust Weitzel, and from the beginning, he used the telegraph line to micromanage Weitzel. Even worse, Stanton sent his undersecretary, Charles Dana, to spy on Weitzel. The most dramatic event of the week occurred on Tuesday morning, April the 4th, the day after the fire. Anyone who was down at Rocket's Landing saw a large open rowboat pulling upriver, its 12 oars flashing in the sunlight. In the stern was a tall black figure dressed in a long black overcoat and a tall black silk hat. Abraham Lincoln had come to Richmond. He'd been visiting Grant at City Point, now Hopewell, so it was just a coincidence that he was there when the situation broke open at Petersburg and Richmond was evacuated. He read Weitzel's telegram of the day before, and he insisted on going to Richmond. He set out with 4 ships, 4 steam-powered ships, but one by one they had to fall by the wayside because of engine trouble or other mishaps. He insisted on continuing and ended up in this open boat powered only by muscle power. Imagine what would happen to the Secret Service if they let the president do that today. On shore, a crowd of freed people gathered around Lincoln and followed his party as they made their way up from the landing towards the White House of the Confederacy, where Lincoln knew he would find Union Army officers. On the way, one woman exclaimed, "I know that I am free, for I have seen Father Abraham." When he got to the house, Lincoln was worn out. It was a hot day. He was only too happy to plop down into Jefferson Davis's easy chair and rest. Afterward, he joined a carriage and took a tour of the city, a very brief tour, and at the Capitol Square, next to the Washington statue, he gave a brief impromptu talk to a mass of freed people. Nobody had the presence of mind to record exactly what he said, which is too bad. But there was one young woman who recorded a secondhand impression of what he said in her diary the next day. She said, "I heard he made an address to the colored people, telling them they were free and had no master now but God." We now come to the story of Lincoln and his meeting with John Archibald Campbell. Remember him, the former Supreme Court Justice and the Assistant Secretary of War for the Confederacy. He stayed behind at some personal risk because he wanted to do something astonishing. He wanted to negotiate an end to Virginia's participation in the war and to Virginia's reentry into the Union. And what luck! Campbell realized that Lincoln was now not at City Point, but 2 blocks away from his house at Davis's house. Lincoln had been worried that his generals might win the war on the battlefield and then botch negotiations, but now it was the president himself who misstepped. When they met a second time the next day, the president dropped a bombshell. He said he'd been thinking about a way to convene the Virginia legislature to see if it would withdraw the state from the Confederacy. If it did, fighting might stop more quickly. For emphasis, Lincoln repeated himself and said he meant, quote, "the very legislature which has been sitting up yonder," and pointed. Campbell had only suggested bringing together a group of distinguished Virginians. It was Lincoln himself who called for reconvening the Virginia legislature, the Confederate Virginia legislature. Campbell was only too happy to accept, and it was clear he intended to extract as much as he could from this offer. And it would be interesting to speculate what might have happened, but events overtook Campbell's effort. 3 days after Appomattox, Lincoln telegraphed Weitzel and told him to withdraw the offer. Belatedly, the president realized his error, especially when Stanton browbeat him, telling him he should not have offered anything to this Confederate official. Weitzel didn't escape Stanton's wrath so easily, and the Secretary of War sacked him and replaced him with General Edward Ord, sent him off to some dusty outpost on the Rio Grande. Now, there's a fitting footnote to Campbell's effort. Despite being overtaken by events, he still didn't give up. He went to General Ord's office on Good Friday, April the 14th. He said he wanted to go to Washington and talk to Lincoln again. Ord thought his proposal had merit, and he sent a telegram to the White House urging the president to accept Campbell. Ord's message arrived at the White House after Lincoln had gone out, but a journalist there agreed to take it to Lincoln in his box at Ford's Theater. That dispatch from Richmond very well may have been the last thing Abraham Lincoln ever read. On the wet Saturday of April the 15th, Robert E. Lee returned to Richmond for the first time after Appomattox. It was his first view of the burned city. When he reached the south bank of the river, the destruction loomed up before him. No matter how he may have steeled himself for the sight, it still must have shocked him. In front of him, where the toll bridge and the 2 railroad trestles had stood, only stone-blackened piers remained in the river, and you can see the remains today. Tottering brick chimneys and piles of rubble stretched all along the waterfront. 9/10 of the commercial heart of Richmond had died, all gone. Even though Lee arrived with just a small group of officers, people had been expecting him, so a crowd began to gather as he made his way across the Union Pontoon Bridge towards his house on Franklin Street. Thomas Chester, the African-American journalist, was there to record the event. He wrote that along Lee's route, the first efforts to cheer him failed. There just weren't enough people. They contented themselves with quietly waving their hats in their hands, a sad pantomime amid the ruins. But Lee's return was not the most dramatic event of the day, as dramatic as it was, because news flashed down the military telegraph from Washington. Lincoln had been shot the night before and was not expected to live. Well, what do we make of all these dramatic events whose 150th anniversary we mark beginning today? Certainly, we can all agree with the words of the extreme secessionist editor Edward Pollard, who said, on April 3rd, 1865, all the hopes of the Southern Confederacy were to be consumed in one day as a scroll in the fire. There's bitterness enough to go around. Bitterness in denial. For some, the failure to accept defeat. And for many years, they denied the fruits of emancipation to the former slaves. They even denied the harshness of slavery. Shortly after the war, there was a story about a conversation between two ministers. The former white minister of the African Baptist Church, Robert Ryland, was talking to a black minister, Peter Randolph. Ryland didn't realize that Randolph had been a slave in Virginia as a child. Ryland tried to convince Randolph that slavery was very mild in Virginia. Okay, we've heard that before. Randolph recalled the conversation and he wrote, if hell was any worse than slavery in Virginia, I did not want to go there. Physically, Richmond could be rebuilt quickly. Now, that was easy. But it wasn't so easy to overcome the pain, the loss, and the racial division that persisted long after the reconstruction of brick and stone. In the words of one modern historian, the former Confederate capital for generations was a city in thraldom to its past. Happily, that thraldom is now in the past. There's still much to be done, but we've seen great change recently. I suspect many of you read Catherine Kalos's excellent article in the Times-Dispatch on Sunday. In it, she quoted Ayers as saying, you have to walk through history to get to any future that's worth having. That's been Richmond's journey for the past 5 or 6 years. Today, we're far better able than before to embrace the events of April 1865, warts and all, our shared past. Those events were the most dramatic in our city's history. They overshadowed everything that had come before in Richmond's history, and they influenced everything that followed, even down to the present. We can now memorialize that past, though, and no longer live there. I'm a glass half full kind of guy, and so finally, at long last, I believe, Richmond has risen, not just physically, but in more important ways, from the ashes of that long ago fire that still seems to me like only yesterday. Truly a phoenix on the James. Thank you very much.
Before we adjourn, we've got time for just a few questions. See if I'll try to recognize you, and Nelson will try to repeat the question for those who did not hear. But a few questions.
So it sounds like the fire actually happened late in the evening, or even around dawn of the 3rd.
The question is, if I can rephrase it, when did the fire happen? The questioner inferred from my comments that it happened very late in the process towards dawn. That's correct. The evacuation was at night from midnight later. There was a great bustle in the city, lots of noise, nobody slept, everybody was out, so the great activity in the hours of the dark, and then towards, well, after the presidential train left, 2, 3 a.m., the looters came out, and there was all this noise of, well, the city council bashing in the barrels of whiskey, but not getting ahead of the mob. The looters came out. There was chaos. Civil order did break down even before the last Confederates were across. The engineers didn't set the first flames until close to dawn. Now, dawn was fairly early then, but, so I don't know, I'm guessing maybe 4. It wasn't too long before first light. And so the fire began to, the bridges were really burning like crazy when the last Confederates left and the first Union soldiers marched in. The fire picked up in intensity during the morning as the Union Army marched in and occupied the city. It didn't abate until late in the afternoon when the wind died down. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Wait.
Would you speak to the Confederate gold supply, and did the Confederate currency immediately lose value, or did it peter out?
The question was, could I talk about the Confederate gold supply? Did the Confederate currency immediately lose value or peter out? The thing about the gold supply is fascinating, but we don't really know much about it. Maybe that's why it remains fascinating and it remains the subject of many books and articles, because we don't know. It wasn't as much as people thought. I said some people estimate between $250,000 and $500,000 in value. Most of it was the property of the banks, not the Confederacy. A lot of it left on the Treasury Train. Some people thought some of it remained in town. So a day after the fire, when the bricks were still hot to the touch, scavengers were digging around where they thought the banks were to find the safes. That doesn't really answer your question. I don't think we really know. There have been gold coins that have been discovered along the Confederate retreat from Danville south, and that's because the presidential entourage paid off some of its last Confederate cavalry escort with gold coins. So ironically, some of the best paid Confederate soldiers were the guys who stuck with Davis all the way to the end. Confederate currency, to answer that part of the question, the next day, kids were picking up $1,000 Confederate notes and using them for kindling. So I'd say that was pretty precipitate. Joe?
Were there accounts of Lincoln's conversations with his son while he was here?
The question was, are there accounts of Lincoln's conversation with his son while they were here? I haven't read any attribution of dialogue or description of what they said, just that there were reporters who were here, and the very next day reported that when Lincoln arrived, he had his young son, Tad, with him. The party in that open boat consisted of 12 sailors, Lincoln, 2 officers, and Tad, and a northern reporter who had been down at Rocket's Landing. Talk about a scoop, he just happened to be there. They all marched up to the White House together. But I don't know of any conversation between the two.
Did Lincoln make any memorialization of his visit to Richmond? Do we have any idea what his impressions were?
That's a good question. I don't recall any conversation he had. There was, when he met with Campbell the second day, Weitzel was with him, and Weitzel asked him, well, how should I treat these people? And Weitzel said Lincoln told him, you should let them up easy, let them up easy. Another source says, let them down easy, let them down easy. The whole point is that there are 2 sources that say Lincoln said the Union Army should be lenient in its occupation.
The second flight,
Okay.
Dr. Lankford, who set the fire?
The question of the moment, who set the fire? You know, when I began doing the research, I had heard stories that, the Yankees set the fire. Well, that, of course, is an urban legend. I didn't find any references to that before the 20th century was well underway. Nobody here believed that. They knew the Confederacy had set the fire. They just had bad luck. The Confederate engineers, they didn't burn private warehouses. containing privately owned tobacco. They only burned government-owned warehouses containing government-owned tobacco because it had value. And they burned the railroad bridges and the toll bridge to deter pursuit. So they did what most armies might do evacuating a city. They just had the bad luck for the wind to arise, and not just to arise, but to arise from the south. If that wind had blown from the north to the south, there wouldn't have been a great fire. But remember, Shockoe Bottom, the buildings down there were wooden, and they had wooden shake roofs. So it burned very quickly, but it was initially set by the Confederate engineers. General Ewell later said, oh, it was the looters who started it, but, well, sorry.
Nelson, thank you so much.